You know the old saying, the one that says that if you can give a man a fish, he can eat for a day, but if you teach him to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. Well, that's what we're going to do in terms of showing you who I think is going to actually decide the case of United States versus Rahimi, the next huge Second Amendment case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in the month of June 2024. I'm going to show you how you can figure this out too. Going forward, you don't have to rely upon me or anybody else to start narrowing down who the justice will be that's going to issue this major decision in Rahimi, dealing with the question of whether or not 18 U.S.C. 922 G8, federal gun control law, is constitutional under the Second Amendment. You're not going to want to miss this breakdown when we get back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. Big announcement coming out very soon with the next book, any day now. All right, folks, so I want to teach you two things. One is I want to show you how to understand who may issue the decision, who may write the opinion on behalf of the court in the Rahimi case. The right answer right now is it appears as if one of the three justices are going to issue the decision. Is either Justice Clarence Thomas, Justice Sam Alito, or Justice John Roberts, specifically Chief Justice John Roberts. One of those three judges are going to write the opinion on behalf of the United States Supreme Court in the United States versus Rahimi, almost certainly. So how do I know this? And how can you figure it out for yourself? Well, I'm going to give you a couple tricks that you can learn and do on your own. The bottom line is this. The United States Supreme Court has what's known as a term. And every term is broken down into argument sessions. Specifically, every term is basically considered 1 year. So the October 2023 term starts in October 2023 and it ends at the end of June 2024. And it's called the October 2023 term because the first Monday of October of every year is considered the start of the new Supreme Court term. So the first Monday in October of 2023 is considered the first day of the 2023-24 term. And again, the Supreme Court always gets all of its work done in terms of issuing its opinions from its term before the 4th of July weekend, always basically by the end of June of the following year. So the October 2023 term will end June 2024. Now, within the term, you have what are known as oral argument sessions. And this is where we can start to figure out who is going to write the opinion in Second Amendment cases, specifically those that have just been argued. In this case, in this video, the United States versus Rahimi case, which, as you may recall, Mr. Rahimi is kind of a bad dude based on the pleadings and the documents, and he was subject to a domestic violence restraining order. And the question is whether or not that federal statute that says if you're subject to a domestic violence restraining order, is that enough to take away your Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms during the pendency of that domestic violence restraining order? And we'll see what the Supreme Court's going to say. I think they're going to rule against Mr. Rahimi specifically, and I think what they're going to say is the statute might be constitutional, but only to the extent that an individual is physically violent, dangerous either to himself or to someone else, and that has to be demonstrated only after a due process and a hearing is provided. But we'll see what the court says. I think that's what they're going to say. I don't think they're going to say the statute is unconstitutional in all respects at all times, which is what they would have to say in order to declare it unconstitutional as a facial matter. But again, we don't need to get into those details because today I want to explain to you why I think it's almost certainly the case that either Justice Roberts, Justice Thomas, or Justice Alito will decide and will write the opinion in Rahimi. So now that I pointed out you have that term from October to June, now you talk about each session. Now each session is basically 1 month. Now the Rahimi case was argued in what's known as the session beginning on October 30th, 2023. If you look at this graphic here on the screen, you'll see there were basically 7 cases here that were argued. You have the Coley versus Marshall, Department of Agriculture versus Kurtz, O'Connor versus Garnier, Linkey versus Freed, United States versus Rahimi, Vidal versus Elster, and Rodasil versus the Secretary of State, or I should say the Secretary of the VA there. So what you do now, and here's the key. If you notice, there's 7 cases argued in that session. Now, Chief Justice John Roberts, in a perfect world, likes to write the majority opinion for the court, one individual judge per session, so that to basically allocate the work among the justices and to allocate the work among the law clerks that work for the justices. So in light of that, you always start with the cases that were argued in that session. And because the Rahimi case was argued in the session that started October 30th, 2023, you look at those cases. Then what happens as the term continues, decisions start to get decided. So right here, right now, as we sit here, Justice Brett Kavanaugh just wrote the majority opinion for the court in a case called Cully versus Marshall, which is a very interesting case dealing with criminal forfeiture laws, which we will talk about in a separate video because there's some very insightful observations that I think we can make about the Second Amendment and the possibility that forfeiture laws may be going away down the road, but that'll be for a separate video. But the point is that Justice Kavanaugh wrote the Cully decision out of this session for the court, and then you look at the other list. Justice Barrett in the Linke case wrote an opinion for the court in the Linke case. So now you have Kavanaugh wrote one opinion for that session. Justice Barrett did the same for that session. Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote the Department of Agriculture versus Kurtz decision. So now again, from that October 30th, 2023 session of oral arguments, one of the cases was decided and written by Kavanaugh, one written by Barrett, one written by Gorsuch. So odds are they're simply not going to get another case to write on behalf of the court for that session. Justice Brown Jackson also had written a decision in Rodasil versus McDonough, but the reality is I don't think Justice Jackson was going to get the Rahimi case either way, but she's almost certainly not going to get it now. So just by looking at those, we know it's almost certainly not going to be Kavanaugh, Barrett, Gorsuch, or Jackson. So now who's left? Well, you have 5 justices left. You have Justice Kagan, who's a liberal, who's never going to get a Second Amendment case on behalf of the court, in my view, while the court stays together, because she's always going to be in the dissent, or she's just not going to have the controlling say in the matter. And same with Justice Sotomayor. So they haven't issued opinions in the session yet, but I don't think they're going to get the Rahimi case. The only other case I should note from the session that hasn't been decided other than the Rahimi is the Vidal case. And the Vidal case involves a trademark question, specifically the role of the First Amendment, the free speech clause of the First Amendment, and the trademark laws. We don't need to get into the details of that, but those are the only 2 cases that have not been decided by the Supreme Court in that session, the Rahimi case and the Vidal case involving the First Amendment and trademark law. So then, if we know it's not going to be Kagan or Sotomayor because they're going to be either in the dissent or they're not going to have the controlling voice to be able to write on the Second Amendment, then who will it be? Will it be Justice, and that leaves 3 possible justices. Justice Clarence Thomas. Obviously, it would be very, very good if Justice Thomas wrote the Rahimi case, because he'll write it in such a way where, although I think he will rule against Rahimi in the sense that he won't find the statute to be facially unconstitutional, he will do it in a way that preserves the Bruin methodology in a very coherent, powerful way. And I think Justice Alito is the same. That gives rise to the possibility of Chief Justice John Roberts writing the opinion, which I don't think will be as good as if it's drafted by Justice Thomas or Justice Alito, but it's certainly possible that Chief Justice John Roberts would write the opinion for the court. I actually don't think it would be terrible if Justice Roberts wrote the opinion for the Rahimi case, because he's actually pretty strong on Bill of Rights cases, and the Second Amendment, of course, is within the Bill of Rights. So I think it would be okay if he did it, although I would personally prefer Thomas or Alito. I think they're much stronger on the Second Amendment than Chief Justice John Roberts, but again, I think Justice John Roberts would be okay in this particular case. Now, with that said, let me just briefly explain who decides who writes the opinion. Well, the bottom line is that as long as the Chief Justice, in this case, Chief Justice John Roberts, is in the majority that's voting in a particular way, then Chief Justice John Roberts, if he's in the majority of the court, gets to decide who writes the opinion. And he, yes, is allowed to assign the opinion to himself to write if he wants. In the unusual circumstance where Chief Justice John Roberts is actually in a dissent, meaning he is opposed to what the majority of the court is doing in a particular case. And I do not think this scenario will come up in the Rahimi case, but if it did, Chief Justice John Roberts, if he were in the dissent with other justices, let's say, then he would decide who would write, let's say, the dissent for the other justices or things like that, or everybody can do their own dissent. But in the majority, then the most senior justice would have the say as to who wrote the court's opinion for the majority. And if Chief Justice John Roberts were in the dissent, then it would either, then it would basically be then it would be Justice Clarence Thomas deciding who was going to write the opinion for the court if Chief Justice John Roberts were in one of the dissenting voices and not in the majority, because Clarence Thomas is the most senior Supreme Court justice behind the Chief Justice John Roberts. But in the Rahimi case, I don't think it's going to be a situation where you have any of the conservatives dissenting. I think it will likely be 6-3. It could even be more than 6-3, finding that the federal gun control law is facially constitutional, but as applied, that's going to require more work by the lower courts. Again, you may not like that outcome. It's not the perfect outcome that I want either, but I think it will ultimately be okay under the circumstances. And remember, as I say on X and here, I don't try to tell you what I want, because I can say as easily as anybody else, shall not be infringed. I don't want this, and say all sorts of things about my opinion. And yeah, if I were on the Supreme Court, maybe I would be better than some of the current justices. I'm sure I would on many issues, including the Second Amendment. But the fact is, I try to tell you what I think is going to happen and what arguments I think will work. That doesn't necessarily mean what I want to have happen, but it's what I think is the best possible way to get the biggest bang for the buck, the most likely to preserve the right to keep and bear arms as much and as robustly as possible, given the constraints of the world in which we live and the people on the Supreme Court and the way the laws and the way the system works. And that's what I'm trying to talk about in the real world here. I can't just say shall not be infringed and say that everything should be struck down as illegal and unconstitutional. As much as I might like that, that's not a world in which I can help you get to, but I can try to get you to a world that is as good as possible given the constraints and issues that we face in our current political and legal systems and cultural systems, which is where we are right now, for better or for worse. So there you have it, folks. Again, I think it's going to be either Clarence Thomas, Justice Sam Alito, or Chief Justice John Roberts. I think it's going to be either Thomas or Alito, but again, I could see the Chief keeping this case for himself, and I don't think it will be bad news no matter who writes the opinion on behalf of the court, any of Thomas, Alito, or Roberts. I think will do a good job and be okay for us in the Rahimi case and get to the right outcome. But only time will tell. We'll know in the next several weeks, and that's where we are. So don't forget to follow me on X at 4Boxes Diner. Make sure you subscribe and resubscribe. Trying to get to 150,000 subscribers here, and we'll see you again soon here at the 4Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.